Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I'm so excited to bring you the author of an absolutely fantastic book that just consumed my weekend. And oh gosh, I can't wait to talk about it. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
My name is Alicia Elliott. I'm a writer who's currently living in Brantford, Ontario. But my family is from Six Nations of the Grand River, which is where the reserve where a lot of the book is kind of like set in the prequel part anyways. My book is called And Then She Fell, and it's kind of like a weird, I guess, cross-genre sort of book about a woman named Alice who lived her whole life on the Six Nations Reserve and kind of fell into this whirlwind romance with this white man who is studying Haudenosaunee planting practices and things like that, and got married, moved to Toronto, is pregnant, and while she's living in Toronto with her baby, her mother has died, and from there she kind of things kind of start to get very strange, and she starts to hear things and see things that kind of beckon back to her past, and it kind of compels her to try to work on this writing this creation story that she feels like she has to write as kind of like homage to her father, and things get kind of wild from there, I guess, if that's like the hopefully legible kind of pitch for it, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is such a pleasure to read. It's really scary and also really beautiful and and really like tense, and there's so many interesting things going on, and you do play with a lot of really cool genres. Before we get into it too much, I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about your journey to the book, how you got into writing, and perhaps maybe how how your writing sort of progressed from your memoir to this, because there are some similar issues at play, but you're doing really different things with them.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess when I was young, like I think a lot of people, I thought that the only kind of books or genre that really mattered was fiction. And so I had always, like, as a kid and everything, really loved books, and kind of aspired to write a novel one day. And as I kind of grew up, life kind of, as life does, shifted around me, and I ended up having my own son when getting pregnant with my son when I was 17. And so that kind of threw a wrench into all of these plans that I had. And so, I went through university for creative writing in English. And then after that, I was just like, okay, I need to figure out stuff like with my son. He needs to have like a stable home life and everything. And so I kind of like, after applying to all of these MFA programs in Canada and not getting into any, I was like, okay, I'm just going to need to like set up everything, move back to Brantford I was living in Toronto at the time, and just like make things stable for my son so that he's like good in school and everything. And I'll figure out this writing stuff later. And I kind of had to, I was working at Starbucks at the time, and I kind of had to work around that. And I eventually started writing pieces that got accepted different places. A lot of them were creative nonfiction pieces and editorials and things like that. And so I kind of went that route. And that was what my first book was. It was kind of like a non-traditional publishing route because I didn't have any MFA background or anything like that. I kind of had to like, I guess, hustle with social media and different things like that to try and build my career outside of those, I guess, more traditional means. And that kind of culminated with my first book, which was A Mind Spread Out on the Ground, which is I call it an essay collection. I guess some of them are kind of memoir-ish, but I don't think of it as a traditional memoir, just because I don't like traditional memoirs. Just in general, not like saying anything as the genre, just, it's more interesting to me to kind of use kind of the essay form to kind of stretch and pull and be able to do whatever the content requires and kind of play and experiment with it. And so I found that very fun. But this was so different, obviously, from the fiction and novels that I originally aspired to write as a kid. And this book kind of started actually as a novella and a short story. And so the novella just was kind of about this woman who was a new mother, and it was kind of pulling from some of my own experiences, and but it just kept getting longer and longer. And I was like, okay, this is going to be a novella. And then I was like, okay, no, this is going to be a novel. It like kept getting too big. And then as I wasn't sure how to necessarily shape it at first, but it occurred to me kind of that my one of my original loves was Anne Rice, and kind of like her Vampire Chronicles, and that kind of like horror-esque kind of like but also not horror at the same time, kind of in between genre. And when I started thinking about like, man, I should be writing something that my young self would like love to read, and that kind of like opened up things for me as I started to try and like be like, okay, I can see how I can move this way. And then the prologue was originally a different short story. I kind of added that in and kind of moved things around, and everything started to kind of make sense. And I was kind of pulling from also my own experiences, because I had experienced psychosis and mania. And so I originally had conceived of Alice as having postpartum psychosis and mania and stuff like that, prior to my own experience of it. So it was kind of this weird thing that it then happened to me. And then I was able to kind of be like, okay, that experience was totally different than what I had thought it was going to be, because I had observed my own mother having psychosis and mania, and the way it looked from the outside is definitely not how it is on the inside. And I thought that was something that was very important for me to kind of try to portray in an empathetic and authentic way, I suppose.
That is so interesting. And there's so much there I want to respond to. The first point, I really actually liked your point about memoir, because I do think that sometimes like memoirs do kind of impose a narrative on a life that might not necessarily exist yet, or that like we are certainly not privy to, in our lifetimes. And essays are like a little bit more exploratory and a little bit, like a little bit more organic in a way. And that's a really interesting idea to me. I would love if you could talk a little bit more about maybe the way that the novel does speak to how culture shapes not only the experience of like mental health, but also how it is perceived from the outside by other people, because it's really about Alice's experience of it, but also how other people around her sort of interpret it themselves and respond to it. Is that something that you thought about like while you were writing?
Yeah, for sure. I had a lot of conversations with my sister about it. And my sister is a Mohawk language learner. She's had to go through a number of years of schooling, and Mohawk is going from English to Mohawk is incredibly difficult. They say that it's like that going from Mohawk to Chinese is like super difficult in terms of the way that it like requires you to think differently in regards to everything, and Mohawk is even more difficult. And so she kind of did all of that, and having that knowledge of how it shapes the way that you think through things and everything. It was really interesting for me to kind of talk through these sorts of things with her as well, because there is so much that has been lost, and the things that we still have in some ways. For our people, we're actually kind of lucky because the anthropologists were really super enamored with Mohawk people and Haudenosaunee people, and so they would spend a whole bunch of time in our communities and they would write all about it. And so there's all of these like primary documentation, which is great, but of course that means that we only have the things that they thought was important through their perspective. And so there are certain things that, you know, even reading back on those primary documents, you have to kind of know the mindset and everything to almost kind of like retranslate some of it back into what it perhaps would have been when our own people were doing that. And, you know, because of so much language loss and because of the way that colonialism really forced our people to change everything about the way that we operated, it kind of made it so that a lot of our spiritual practices and ways of looking at things and everything, we're lucky to still have them in some ways, because the Mohawk community on Six Nations, a lot of them were very Christian, and the only reason we have certain ceremonies and things like that today is because the Cayuga people, who are another one of the Six Nations, and were very decidedly against Christianity, were very protectionist and kept all of these things to themselves. But there's still things that we have lost. And so in terms of that, it's when I was talking to my sister kind of about the ways that we would have interpreted you know, what we call mental illness, things like that, it was interesting because we kind of talked about how other cultures and communities kind of talk about it, because we don't necessarily have the same language in a lot of ways. And so those things that were lost and stuff like that, we kind of just have to make guesses at. And so it was kind of I guess part of it was kind of me thinking through some of this stuff, and also thinking through, like, you know, for example, the ways that you know, a lot of indigenous people feel very, very scared in some ways of doctors, of hospitals and things like that, because to this day there's still you know, forced sterilizations that are happening on indigenous women without their consent in hospitals, but also in prisons and things like that. And so, you know, we have this history of really difficult interactions with the medical community. I mean, here in Canada, in residential schools, they did nutrition experiments on starving indigenous kids, and because they were the control, they had to keep starving them. And these scientists were aware that these kids were starving, because that made them the perfect control group for these nutrition experiments. And then they therefore had to keep starving them. And so this was also that they could figure out ways, like vitamin research and stuff like that. And all of that ended up becoming basically like the food pyramid and food guide in Canada. So we, like, you know, we have this really complex history with medical professionals, with you know, hospitals. There were like Indian hospitals and things like that where people were sent when they had tuberculosis, and it was basically places they went to die. And so we have this like very, very complex hurtful history with the medical community. And so having all of that awareness, I did want to kind of bring that into the book, and I kind of do that through not just Alice and her own experiences, but also Alice's mother's experiences with trying to have you know, her own like chronic pain dealt with and things like that. And so, you know, I kind of wanted to speak to these sorts of things in a way that felt natural. And so I guess being aware of how different cultures look at things in different ways was particularly important to me, but also being aware of how you know, in many ways Western colonial kind of white ways of viewing indigeneity is also to pathologize in all ways. And so this, why are you so angry? Why are you so why are you saying this is racism? Why can't you get over it? All of these things that are also ways to make you feel crazy with how you're moving through the world and being treated, and kind of playing with those parallels through perspective and things like that, and who Alice is interacting with and how they're treating her based on sometimes things they don't know. You know what I mean? Like the things they're assuming and bringing to her. So yeah.
Wow. Yeah. One of the most forceful points, I think, of the book kind of is like how you were just saying, like that colonialism like works through an entire society's institutions, not just government, but through medicine, as you said, and through academia, which is like a really big part of this too. And it really illustrates like the kind of vicious cycle of like how colonialism acts on people, because like it causes trauma, and then the people who have been traumatized are then blamed for being traumatized, and that's just used as like further justification, and like it's really like it does a very good job of like illustrating the systemic nature of it. Could you talk a little bit about like how Steve and like the academic institutions kind of figure into all this too? Because I fled academia to libraries, and that's why I'm here now, and it's great. So a lot of that like resonated with me a lot. So could you talk about that aspect too?
Yeah, for sure. So when I was kind of conceiving of Steve and his character, in like the earliest drafts, I didn't really have any idea what he wanted to do, and it was only, or what he was going to do as like a profession. And it was only kind of as I started thinking through things and reading through also certain texts, in particular Rick Montour's work, which is kind of part of the epigraph in the beginning, and he was kind of talking about the ways that academia, like basically the field of anthropology, started with these academics who were studying our people and then writing about our people, and that kind of is like the creation of anthropology as a field in academia, and what that meant in terms of like people, kind of what I mentioned earlier, seeing things through their own lens, and then kind of drawing assumptions or making assumptions about particular things, like people assuming, for example, that our people worshipped like water and trees and all of these things as gods, essentially, and how that was so stupid or whatever. But that wasn't actually what we were doing. We were we have something called the Thanksgiving address, which we do, which we have someone recite kind of at the beginning of meetings, and the beginnings of days and things like that, where we're basically acknowledging every element of creation, because without them we wouldn't be able to exist. So it would be saying things like we give thanks and acknowledgement to the water for being able to provide us with nourishment, to water the grasses and the trees, and to give a home to to fish, things like that, right? And that's kind of what I also kind of talk about a little bit in the book as well, with kind of the Thanksgiving address and how that kind of plays into things. And so kind of that whole concept is very important, but also can be misinterpreted, just like all things. And so in terms of academia now, it kind of, I personally have, I guess, a lot of frustration, because in some ways I think that the academy, although it's like a great because I guess it gives you a space to kind of study these things and all of this, an incentive to do that. If you're, for example, a Haudenosaunee person who wants to study your culture, you can do that within the academy in some ways. But the way that it operates is very, very much protectionist, keep everything in, even in terms of the language that is spoken. It's technically English, but it's all in theory, right? And it's all in these ways, using all of this terminology that the people who you're theorizing about can't understand, and therefore they can't engage with it, and therefore it's very it's very, sorry, I'm trying to think of the correct word, because I don't want to say it's necessarily violent, but I think that it is it's keeping out the people who you're talking about, right, from being able to speak back. So some of these academics who wrote about our people would write these things in English, and it's not like our people could have read, or they submitted to them to read before publishing, so that they could make sure they got everything accurate. And then that after, these same people who are so interested in studying our culture are also at the same time in levels of government trying to distinguish our culture at the same exact time, so that later all we have to refer back to are these books, these people who didn't understand us and didn't make sure that that we were making sure that they said everything that in a way that represented us correctly and accurately and fairly. Now that's what we have too. And so, like, in some ways, the act, like, it's a kind of a double-edged sword, because yes, they did kind of take this and preserve it in a way, preserve their vision of it in a way, but also the fact that these people, at the same time as they're so interested, they want to make their name in academia on studying us and writing about us, they don't at the same time lobby for us to continue to exist as we are, so that we can speak back to these things and keep these things for ourselves, instead of having to eventually, after these colonial government projects, get us where they want us, in a certain sense, where we don't have that at the same way, where we don't have to refer back to these texts because we have this, you know what I mean? So there's that kind of push and pull of it, and this way that of looking at the people that you're studying in a very dehumanizing way, and distilling it down to what is the consumable thing that I can take from this. And in the case of academia, that's often culture or knowledge or language or things like that. They're taking those things because they want to make their name on them. They're resources, again, that are being extracted and done with whatever they will, when the people that they're extracting them from have no say over it, or don't give consent, essentially.
Yeah. There's a really powerful moment, and I'm going to talk about the moment without talking about what goes on around it, where, they're talking about, in a very sort of academic conversation, about whether a genocide happened, and then somebody says oh, well, maybe it was a cultural genocide. And and to me that really illustrates the way that academia can sometimes its surface motivation is to preserve and protect these cultures and to save them for posterity, but also there is a little bit of a legitimating of colonialism going on there. It is providing the language that will soften the way that what happened to a people is perceived, if that makes sense. That moment was so illustrative of the exploitative nature sometimes of these relationships between academics and those they study. It was very so crystallizing.
Oh, good. That's good to hear.
Could we talk a little bit about the story that Alice is writing, her novel that she's writing within this novel? It's really beautiful, and I love how you distinguish her writing voice from yours so much. There's two very different tones, but they are also linked, because you give us Alice's perspective, and then we get her voice through her writing. And it's unique, but it also feels like it emanates from her, if that makes sense too.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk a little bit about crafting, the version of a creation story that she's crafting, while also sort of questioning, you're not questioning it, but providing multiple interpretations and opening up stories to new ideas and stuff like that. So can you talk about that, and how her text interacts with like the events of the novel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have been very interested for a long time in storytelling and the way that it operates within my culture in particular. So within Haudenosaunee culture. And one of the things that is that I find very fascinating is that, you know, there are some indigenous cultures where you have to like memorize word for word, basically, how this story, because you have to preserve it in that way. And there's like, you know, a lot of like Coast Salish communities have that kind of idea, is that you have to keep it exactly as it is. But for what I thought was interesting for our culture is that, you know, we're very much of the mindset that, like, you know, when you're telling a story, you have to be mindful of your audience and who you're telling it to, and you kind of that determines how you're going to tell it. And so you have the story, but you can kind of do it in different ways depending on who you're talking to. So like if you're, you know, a storyteller that's telling a story to adults, you can have kind of these funny innuendos or things like that kind of like make it appealing to adults, and they're laughing about these things and stuff like that. Whereas if you're telling it to kids, you might want to, like, you know, pull up or like leave those out, but then kind of have a more exciting tone, or like trying to add in these like moments of suspense and really kind of like and amplify them through how you're talking and gesturing and all of these different things, right? And I thought that was so fascinating because, you know, going from, you know, oral storytelling to written storytelling, in a sense, that element is removed. You can't just, you know, but depending on who's reading your story, change what details you're relaying, change what the tone that you're using and things like that. And so, you know, I wanted to, because I was so interested in that, that was something I wanted to kind of explore within the story, and have Alice kind of grappling with these things as she tries to figure out her own way of telling the story, as opposed to her father's way of telling the story, or different other storytellers who have told the story. And so the story she is telling to start is the creation story, which you know, I guess I think it's rather colloquially kind of known, I suppose, the Sky Woman story, as she falls through the hole in the tree and then she falls down to earth, and the animals kind of see her. They send some birds up to catch her, and as they're kind of bringing her slowly down, the animals are like, we got to figure out something because there's just water here. And they send kind of these different animals down to try and grab this clay from the bottom of all of the water. And these animals that are supposed to be like great swimmers, it's so far down they keep dying, and it's only, you know, the muskrat who comes back and has this tiny little, like, he comes back and he's dead and he's floating on the water, and they realize at the end that he has a little bit of clay in his hand, and that's what they end up using to kind of put on the turtle's back to create you know, what is called Turtle Island, or it's called North America, I guess. And so, you know, that story is very like well known in a sense, but what fascinated me was the story of Sky Woman prior to when she became Sky Woman. And so you know, someone who did something seemingly arbitrary and small, which is like, you know, falling through a hole, and then other people are catching her and setting her up so that she can, like, you know, survive on this unknown planet away from all of her family. But like what happened prior to that, and there are these different stories about that, and they all change. And what I thought was fascinating, and I mentioned this in the book, is that, you know, even the story of Sky Woman falling in general changed as a result of, you know, the women's lib movement in the 70s. That had an influence in our community on how people were telling the story of Sky Woman jumping instead of just falling. She saw, and she was like, I'm gonna go, like, this is this is my choice. And so how that that shifts depending on the perspective and everything like that. And I kind of wanted to, within Alice kind of thinking through these things and trying to figure out her own voice and how she wants to tell it as opposed to how other people want to tell it. I thought that it gave me an opportunity to kind of talk through these sorts of things in a way that felt authentic to the story, but also kind of made it so that even if I couldn't actually like say, change the book for whoever is reading it, there's I could give other interpretations and tell you how other people have told the story or how you could interpret the story. And also thinking through like every story, you know what I mean? Even written ones as well, our interpretation is what we bring to it, right? And so, I wanted to kind of emphasize that is that every story, every life really is about what we bring to it, the perspective we bring to it, our values and what we put onto that life or that story. And that those things can change depending on our perspective. If someone tells us something else, we'd be like, oh, I didn't think of it that way, and then shift, so it's kind of what I was hoping to kind of do. Just a small tiny thing, but, with that, and I thought it was fun for me to try and do that.
Yeah, it's fun to read too. Like those sections, like they speak to the narrative in a really interesting way, but also provide like a little bit of like tension release sometimes, so they function so beautifully. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been really lovely, and it's been so nice to chat with you about this book. It was just such a pleasure to read, and I'm really excited for our patrons to read it. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so nice to talk about it. Book technically hasn't come out yet, and so it's like that when you're in that weird limbo from like waiting for your book to come out, you're just like, what's it gonna be like? What are people gonna think? So it's kind of nice to actually like talk about it with a real live person who's not just my editor.
Oh, happy to be of service. That's great. Well, yeah, thank you so much. And, you're always welcome back on the show for your next project. Like, I'm very excited to see what you do next too. So just thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You're so lovely.
All right, listeners, please check out And Then She Fell. By the time that you hear this, it will be available. So please go to your favorite independent bookstore or library, wherever you like to get your books. Thanks so much for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.